The Flobel Education Committee is eager to dialogue and brainstorm the ways we may, as key leaders, address urgent issues. We believe in the power of our collective voices and individual efforts to bring innovation and hope where discord and deep challenges exist. With these objectives in mind, we've selected today's topic for our panel discussion, addressing the phenomenon of public education hostile forces gathering to undermine our schools. Dr. Rose Rudnitsky, Ravi Hutheesing, and I hope to engage our members in consideration of this phenomenon and ways we might respond. First, an overview of the crisis. It's popular for politicians to declare their fidelity to an educational goal of teaching students how to think, not what to think. Partisan politicians have in 2022 appropriated this teacher tagline, which was of course first uttered by anthropologist Margaret Mead, to argue against values-based critical inquiry. Ironically, their efforts have only heightened the politicization of the public education space. By cynically manipulating this common sense critical thinking goal, these partisans argue against the myth of critical race theory curricula. They attack wokeism in educational equity efforts, such as Florida's Don't Say Gay law. And they are succeeding in driving a wedge between the traditional allies of parents and teachers. They're doing this by instilling fear and calling for more parent oversight and teacher accountability. Their tactics have included not only state legislative initiatives, but also disrupting school board meetings, taping conversations with educators, calling for book banning, and forming political action committees to support far-right political candidates hewing to their agenda. So it's not the how to teach methods that are undergirding their narrative, it's the what to teach objective. These agitators object to the very notion of equity-based values in school climate and curriculum. So it would be more accurate to say that they are pushing for a what to teach intervention that mirrors their own anti-equity beliefs. Ideology may be an attractant to voters, but the real reason powerful interests are funding and motivating these efforts is tactical. Right-wing political strategists have ignited this new chapter of the culture wars in the education space, primarily for political gain. In my home state of Oregon, for instance, educators are facing down the ultimate politicization of their schools, just as they are in virtually every US state. To some degree, theirs is also an effort to shut down the march toward justice, but its most profound purpose is to drive that wedge I mentioned a minute ago between the powerful confederation that's traditionally existed between parents and teachers, and exploiting the pandemic and white grievance in order to take back political seats lost in 2020. And we saw what happened in the 2022 midterms, but now we're already in the 2024 presidential cycle. Hitchhiking along for the ride are anti-trans activities, attacks on gender equality, and reckless anti-public health agitation, topics that light up voter fear and move them to reject more progressive political candidates up and down the ballot. So to foment this battle, operatives stage efforts to turn school board meetings into chaos, confront board members and educators at their schools and their homes, agitate to remove books from school libraries and even school classrooms. And they began with the anti-COVID interventions, such as masks and school closings, moving now to a broader list of grievances. In Oregon, our home state's conservative school district's education leaders have been fired for following state laws related to equity in curriculum and school climate. And just last October, a Republican legislative leader called for the firing of our state superintendent of public instruction, scapegoating him for pandemic-related declines in high-stakes test scores. But there's good news. Practically speaking, the use of critical inquiry is a pedagogically sound teaching technique that, according to research, boosts student achievement and demonstrates important values such as good citizenship and informational literacy. A dozen studies collected over the past 3 decades have shown that culturally responsive teaching has a positive educational benefit for students of all races and ethnicities. These studies scrutinize culturally responsive teaching in literature, social studies, and even mathematics curricula. They found that students develop a stronger sense of personal empowerment, they perform better educationally, and they graduate at higher rates. So the ability of educators to employ their professional judgment in their teaching is also, of course, a matter of academic freedom. In some of the states where anti-equity laws have been enacted in the last year or two, lawsuits have been filed to protect teachers' free speech and equal protection rights. In Oregon, a Yamhill County Circuit Court recently ruled that the Newburgh School District's policy restricting displays of Black Lives Matter signs and gay pride flags violated Oregon's Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. The court prohibited enforcement of the policy, and lawsuits in other states, such as Arizona and Oklahoma, are also challenging such restrictive speech laws. Defusing this political minefield may be seen as crucial to educational excellence as well as to the survival of democracy itself. Teachers are instrumental in helping students acquire analytical skills. They help students learn the theoretical vocabulary necessary to evaluate and interpret texts, narratives, facts, and events from multiple and oftentimes opposing perspectives so that they may reach their own conclusions. These skills enable students to gain critical awareness of how their values, beliefs, and assumptions shape their understanding of history and current events. Critical literacy curriculum provides opportunity for students and teachers to engage in what Paulo Freire has described as the critical reading of the word and the world. In this way, students can acquire not only the cognitive tools to understand the world, but also the civic courage and moral responsibility to participate in democratic life as change agents, becoming authors of their own history rather than being written off by it. So that's my overview. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose Rudnitsky to offer her comments about this phenomenon, to be followed by Ravi Hutheesing, who will offer his thoughts about how we may be able to address it successfully. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to offer an historical perspective on this because it's really nothing new. In 1893, the Committee of 10, which was 10 college presidents led by the president of Harvard University, came up with the ultimate, what they thought of as the ultimate high school curriculum. And it was the high school curriculum that I had when I went to high school. You know, you had 4 years of science and 4 years of math, and ended in trig, and ended in physics. And it was the college-ready curriculum that they deemed necessary for success in life. Of course, that was not available to all children at that time, and they didn't care about that. That wasn't one of their priorities. And then we have at the turn of the century, we have Indian boarding schools. Native boarding schools were to deculturize an entire population, and it was okay in almost every state. In every state, New York had a boarding school, the Thomas boarding school, and it was not deregistered until 1946. So I am a New Yorker, and I'm proud to be a New Yorker. I think we have a very progressive state, but we also have a history that we have to face and understand that that history has affected populations who have been minoritized by policies and practices that have occurred before. You mentioned Margaret Mead, and that's so wonderful because in the 1970s, there was a great multimedia, at that time, film strip and video, and that was multimedia social studies curriculum called Man, A Course of Study. And instead of being, and Nell Noddings has written about this, she's a great philosopher of education. If women had made the social studies curriculum, it would not have been focused on war to war to war to war. And if you think about it, that's what it is. And Man, A Course of Study was totally different. It was focused on an anthropological view, not an anthropocentric, anthropological view. And so one of the films was of an Inuit tribe going on a communal whale hunt, and getting a whale. Everybody's waiting anxiously on the shore to get their year's worth of food, basically, from this one whale. And they come in on their kayaks with the whale, and they meet it out. If communally, everybody gets their share. Well, there was an uproar about that social studies curriculum, there was such a backlash that it was banned. MACOS, it was called. You can look it up. Manor Course of Study was banned from the social studies curriculum because it realistically depicted an Inuit ceremony that was very sacred to them. And people say, no, I don't want my children to see this kind of stuff. So it's been politicized for when we finally got our education system together in the late 1900s. It's been politicized ever since. There's been a pendulum swing of reforms. There was a back to basics movement after the reforms of the 1960s. The civil rights movement changed the curriculum, and there was a backlash, back to basics. And then we found the research of Lev Vygotsky, who had written in 1924, at the same time as Piaget. Piaget was very cut and dried and sequential, and Vygotsky was very sociology minded. And he talked about how children learn from each other. And as a mother, I've had two kids. The younger one learned faster than the older one because the older one was teaching him all the time. And so we had social construction of meaning. And so we changed the literacy curriculum to be comprehension based rather than phonetically based. And we called it whole language. Well, whole language was anathema. It was a bad, it was a curse word to the conservatives. It was, the kids were reading books instead of reading in reading books. They were reading literature. And this was upsetting to them. Now obviously, it's culminating now, or it's progressed now to banning books again. Book banning has been going on forever. And I have to really say that I'm very respectful of the American Library Association. It has defended books against banning and censorship right through its history. Very, very wonderful thing. But so we've had this. What made it the worst and what made it take a turn for the worst was the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan commissioned a report by a committee that he appointed, and that report was called A Nation at Risk. And it was during the whole language time. And in that, there's if an enemy had done this to our educational system, we would have started a war over this. Well, those people probably would have. But so that war started in 1983 with A Nation at Risk. And Reagan did an awful lot to turn this country from a progressive point of view that we started in the 60s, where we were, finally realizing that civil rights were human rights, and women had rights too. I remember, I met my late husband at an Equal Rights Amendment rally, and that never happened. I used to wear a button with 59 cents on it because at that time women earned 59 cents to a man's dollar, and now I think it's up to 79 or 80 cents. And so we were fighting for human beings to be all treated equally, and school is a part of that. School has always been a sorting machine, to quote Joel Spring, that sorts the children into winners and losers. And the same children lose all the time. The statistic that correlates most strongly with test scores, standardized test scores that are claimed to be culturally, neutral, which they're not. The statistic that correlates most strongly is family income. So when we give these kids these standardized tests made up by these people, multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies who have no clue what it's like to live in the Bronx. And who's always a loser? The children who don't have the same background as the people making the test. And so I've seen it. I got my doctorate at Columbia University, and I ran the student teaching program. And I was in PS 75, looking at first graders taking a standardized test, a tutorial test. And there's a little boy from Guatemala who's looking at a picture of a kangaroo, and he's got to answer a question about a kangaroo, which is something he's never seen in his life. And the assumption of the test makers was every kid in first grade knows what kangaroos are. Well, no. And so that's how we minoritize populations and in schools. And as educational leaders, it is our job to stop those processes and practices. As I said, I am very fortunate to be a New Yorker. Betty Rosa, who was one of my colleagues at Mercy College, is the Commissioner of Education, the Board of Regents. We have a multicultural Board of Regents. We have DEI mandates in our state that our administrators are trying to carry out in good faith. And we have board meetings where people are forcibly taken out because they're shouting and abusing. I show in one of my classes, I teach educational leadership, a video of a school district in Putnam County, a board meeting, where the board president is Jewish, and there's someone in the audience, yelling at him and calling him a Nazi. And he said, I'm highly offended by that. And it is so right. When we gets up at this board meeting and says, I want to know who's funding the education of these illegals. She has no data, no nothing, and yet this is all racism. It's just one ism after another. It's bias that is invisible to the people who own it, who hold it. And so we have to have these difficult conversations in this country between these sides, and so that they understand each other's views, and they have to be evidence-based conversations, not conversations based on I think or I was told, and I didn't critically think about what I was told. And so this is really what's the problem. The internet has made it really easy to deceive, and there's a whole population now that wants its own beliefs to be reinforced, and it's reinforced by the deception. It's not just critical race theories; it's the replacement theory that it's been around since Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, who did the Oklahoma City bombing, wanted to start a race war because he thought people of color were going to replace white people. That was in the 1990s, and so it really is not new. All this stuff has been amplified by the internet and the media, and that amplification shows that we have a lot of non-critical thinking going on among the adult population of this country. So we really have to have the conversations. Most of my students are women of color who teach in the Bronx. There is no diversity in their schools. There are no white people, and their schools are underfunded. They have coal-fired furnaces, and it's so obvious that New York City is one of the most segregated school districts in the country. So we have a lot of work to do in getting to know each other and getting to treat each other with compassion rather than as enemies, because we hold different views. And all of us as educators want the best for every single child. And that belief and the faith in that promise has been undermined by people with an agenda to undermine it. And so, all of us in teacher education, our enrollments are down. People don't want to become teachers. The teachers have been trashed for 40 years now, overtly. And it's really a difficult field to be in. Plus, you're giving emotionally all day long. Children need love. They need understanding. They don't just need to be taught. They're not automatons. Otherwise, we could have robots teaching them. That would not make a humanity. And so we have to understand that we're making human beings. And yes, we have SEL, social emotional learning, but we have to have more than that. And I think uniting us as a humanity is part of that. I'm very hopeful that the climate change is happening at much faster rates than we ever thought possible. And I see a lot of young people doing really radical things to try to draw attention to it, because it's their future. We think we're not going to be here when it happens, but it is happening now. And I'm old enough that I shouldn't be here when it happens, and it is happening right now. With this winter storm that's coming has already killed a mother and a child with a tornado. That didn't happen 20 years ago. And so that I think climate change is really going to unite the youth to demonstrate. I've been demonstrating since the Vietnam War, and to become active, to protest, and we see it happening in China. It's not just COVID that they're demonstrating against, and so and Iran. The young people are risking their lives to effect change, and we have to support that, even if it's just emotionally and with energy directed toward it. So that's my historical perspective. I look forward to hearing Ravi.
Well, let me jump in. Nice setup, really interesting perspectives and overview. So thank you to both of you for leading off with that. I guess, you covered so much here, and certainly in certain things like that you talked about how the internet has amplified a lot of this. And it certainly has, and it's been a great source of disinformation, but it is also a great source and misinformation, but a great source of information as well. People have access to more good information than they've ever had. They just have more access to information, whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, left, right, it doesn't matter. It's coming from all angles. And so part of, I think, the education system's job is to teach people how to teach kids how to sort through all of this information, critically think about it, as you touched on. And of course, one of the areas that I focus on is civil discourse, because there's just less and less of it, often due to this medium. I make my living primarily as a keynote speaker, and my primary audiences are educators. And over the past 2 years, coming out of the pandemic, my primary audiences have been school boards, because the subjects that I talk about, cultural competence, uniting people, civil discourse, are all culminating as problematic areas in these school board meetings that are going around in the country. And I was honored to have Laurie in my audience just about a month ago, when I gave the keynote for the Oregon School Boards Association. That same week, I did Kansas, North Carolina, and Wyoming. And the conversations that I get to have with all these school board members are really what informs me about what we're talking about and what goes on. And what I come away from is that there is so much good that is going on in our school boards, so much good that is happening in our public education system, that the noise that we're discussing, while it's important to shut it down, so far isn't overtaken. And so I think that's a very positive aspect, at least in my view, that I see that. We have just an amazing country full of great, bright teachers, administrators, and school board members whose eyes are on the students in the most positive of ways and are really looking out for their best interests. But most of them have also been subjected to the issues that you're bringing up, and this hostility, especially in school board meetings, which no doubt all of this that has gone on for so many years is affecting probably the biggest crisis in education, which is the teacher shortage, which you touched on as well. That's really where we need to be concerned about, is how does all of this really impact, maybe not our students directly, but how does it impact the teachers, which then impacts the students? Because we have to make sure that we have a great selection of highly qualified teachers that are molding and cultivating, our future. The leaders of tomorrow, our students. So I think those are the issues that I find are most interesting to really address, is the impact that all this politicization has actually on the future of our education and the future of our education systems. So yeah, information is really important, that we teach our students and our teachers and our parents how to distill this information. One of the things I talk about is data triangulation as a pilot, which is something I am as a hobby. We never look at one instrument in our airplane to determine what it's doing. We look at a minimum of 3. And I think one of the things that the education system needs to talk about is the importance of looking at more than one source of data, before we form an opinion on a subject like critical race theory. Critical race theory, CRT, being probably still the most hot button topic among school boards that I hear about. This has been going on now for a couple of years, at least ever since, I think Donald Trump basically picked that as a political football. Because one thing most of us, I think, can agree on about Donald Trump is that he does know how to brand things. He's somewhat of a branding genius. And he knew how to take the term CRT, regardless of what it really is, and get a movement behind it that has been the driving movement that's been disruptive amongst our school boards and our school board meetings. Those of us in education, most of us didn't know what CRT was until this came up. And so we looked into it and we educated ourselves on it. And I'll just speak for myself. Once I realized what it actually was, my immediate reaction was, wow, we should be teaching this in school. This is really, this is really important stuff that has nothing to do with what anybody's talking about. They're calling it CRT, but it has nothing to do with what CRT really is. And, you know, CRT is a very important theory that looks at our judicial system to see how the history of racism may still be part of our institutional racism today, and how that affects our judicial processes. I know of no school, high school level, that is teaching this. Yet, I don't think it would be such a bad idea if we start introducing it, because it's an important topic. But it has nothing to do with what the parents are and the media and the public are saying about CRT. That being said, they're saying this for a reason. Their passion has been stoked on a subject that they feel, and perhaps rightly so, directly affects their families. You know, and that may have been done in a very calculated way for political gain, but on the grassroots level, parents, teachers, students, where we need to focus, the parents are upset about something that shouldn't be disqualified at all. Because there's something going on about this that they're relating to, and they're calling it CRT, but it's not CRT, but it's something. So I always feel like that we have to make sure that we are still open to those conversations, and we don't get caught up in the branding of it that has been done quite well, and instead we get to the true meaning of what is disrupting families over what's happening in education. So that's part of the civil discourse angle, and what I hope that school board members are able to do is to not take offense to this attack, but rather take the opportunity to figure out what is really behind the attack, not on a political level, but on a human level. What is really driving it? And I think if they do that, we can start to solve some of these issues and realize that we are more united than we are divided. I believe at the core we are. I mean, everybody at some level, few exceptions, but the majority, let's say, really do have our kids' interests at heart. That's really what they want. I believe that all teachers have that. I believe that all school administrators have that. I believe that most school board members, but not all, have that. And that's because there are some school boards that have been infiltrated by those that have a different agenda, who are, it sounds so draconian, but who are essentially functioning as operatives of these political movements. But that's what's happening. That is happening. It's not the majority of what's happening, but it's there, and it needs to be recognized, and it needs to be silenced so that we can put 100% of our focus on our children. So I don't know, what else can I say? I think that when we look at the younger generation, you know, yes, they are standing up. They are now protesting, but actually they were doing that in 2019 too. We saw protests in Venezuela, in Chile, in France. We saw people, especially young people, rising up over inequality, over growing disparity, healthcare, education. And with the murder of George Floyd, we saw a huge uprising of young people, you know, taking to the streets and fighting for social justice on racial issues. So you know, these younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are really rising to the occasion, and the same occasion that the older generations did during the Vietnam War and other times. So, you know, Rose, to your point, very little has actually changed. You know, when we look at it in history, in some ways, history is just repeating itself, and that's part of what. That's part of the cycle that I hope that we can break as an education system, to make sure that we do make real progress, and that George Floyd shouldn't have happened after Rodney King happened, what, 20 years earlier, you know? I mean, it just, there should be progress on all fronts on all of these things. And that's where I believe our education system needs to focus. And the noise, unfortunately, is a huge disruption and distraction to where they need to be focusing. And that's another key area why the noise needs to be silenced, is so that the education leaders can get back to what it is that they're mandated to do, which is to really give our children the best education and give them the opportunity to go out in the world and pivot, which is something I talk about a lot. My latest book is called Pivot: Empowering Students Today to Succeed in an Unpredictable Tomorrow. And I believe that's what our school systems are generally doing, able to do, capable of doing, but can do it a lot better if we don't get in their way.
Wonderful. Well, if this is a good time, I have some questions I'd love to throw out to the panelists. This has been a fascinating to hear all of your perspectives. First, I just want to ask, you know, if schools are not going to be teaching CRT, if they're not teaching CRT, but politicians are using the term CRT as a tool to engage and motivate the public around, as you said, a brandable theme, what's the most appropriate and effective response from the teaching community to correct the narrative without disqualifying the underlying concerns of parents?
Well, right, that's what I was alluding to, you know, really when I was talking about the fact that these feelings are genuine that are coming from some of these parents. So even if they're misdirected or misunderstood, it's coming from somewhere. And one of the things, I was actually having dinner after my presentation for Wyoming. I had dinner with Governor Gordon, and he's a Republican. And, you know, I really enjoyed talking to him, and it was very open-minded, very interesting. And that's one of the things that, just to slightly digress, that when we look at Republicans and Democrats in this conversation of politicizing the classroom, just in general, we can't put all Republicans into one box, and we can't put all Democrats into one box either. We have extremists on both sides, and those extremists are what's driving the narrative in one direction or the other. And so I think it's very important that we recognize that if we can bring everybody back to the middle, which is where I hope that I am and where I hope that I stay, these conversations can happen across the aisle, or in my case with Governor Gordon, you know, across the table, because that's how we solve problems, and that's how we will find solutions. So one of the things that came up during that conversation was that, you know, maybe the appropriate response is to say, and this is something I talked about before because it came up in a school board meeting, I think in Loudoun County, Virginia, in a very hostile school board meeting. But one of the responses that we can give to a parent who says something like this is, I agree with you. I don't want any child to hate themselves for the color of their own skin. And that's one of the things that these parents are really talking about. Especially if we have a white parent, which is usually the case, who's opposed to the teaching of critical race theory, which is not what they're really opposed to. But they're upset that their child is coming home and feeling guilty for being white. And I don't want any white child to go home and feel guilty for being white. I don't want any black child to go home and feel guilty for being black. I don't want any child to go home and feel guilty for the color of their skin. So we can all agree on this. And if there is something happening in a school system that makes any child feel that way, well, we have to address it. That's our job. We have to figure out where that's coming from. Could it be happening in a public school system? Well, sure, it could be. Teachers are humans too. We all have implicit biases. Sometimes our biases get the better of us. Sometimes we express ourselves in ways that could be misunderstood, or perhaps we express ourselves in a way that we shouldn't, but we can't help ourselves sometimes. We're humans. Teachers are humans too. But we have to make sure that our school system is not causing any child to feel that way about themselves. And so from my perspective, that's one of the ways to push back on this conversation, move the conversation into a place where we can all agree, and then say, if this is a problem, and if this is happening, we can all agree it has to be addressed.
The one thing I would add, though, is that we have very powerful forces that are setting folks against each other, and there isn't a dialogue going on. There's a screaming match going on. Second largest school district in Oregon had to close its school board meetings to the public out of a sense of danger because of the ever escalating, tense, nasty behavior of some of the folks who'd been set upon on the school board members. They aren't reading the books they demand to be banned. They aren't listening to the details of the curriculum. The Heritage Foundation has a how-to kit for parents of how to agitate. And this is, as I said, not coming from a place of, from those who are controlling the fight. They're not doing it for reasons of genuine fear of how their children are being educated. I think individual parents certainly are, but not the folks who are driving this whole war. Playing that culture war card is something that, as Dr. Rudnitsky said, has been going on for a very long time. This is just the latest chapter in that book. I can remember the Lee Atwater days. He was very overt about using, remember the Willie Horton ad that was deliberately used to try to get voters to oppose the election of the Democrat who was running for president that year. Those kinds of tactical moves are very deliberate, and they're designed for purposes other than educational. I believe we're bringing politics into education space and pretending it's about student learning. If it were only about that, I agree with you that that dialogue would happen more clearly and more often. Right now, we have a different kind of phenomenon, I believe.
I think we can use data also. We really need to demand evidence for what they believe, because we have a great deal of evidence for the inequality that we produce in schools. And I teach how to do equity audits. You can tell the police with the thing with the police with George came out in the public with George Floyd. We all watched it happening in real time, but it's more subtle in schools. If you're a child of color, especially a boy, you're more likely to be suspended than any other piece of the population, and more likely to be identified for special education. I mean, we have data that shows this, and it's because of implicit bias on the part of the educators, but also on the part of the policies and the way we work together. So I do think that evidence is important, and the quality of the evidence has to be important too. You always have to research where information is coming from, because sometimes that is hidden. And in that agenda, the Heritage Foundation, I did not know that they did that. So it's just, I don't know what the end game is in their heads, but to me, it's a lot of conflict and a lot of hatred if we keep going in that direction. And what we really need is a lot of compassion and a lot of peace in our communities and in our our country, and that starts at the local level. The founding fathers were very wise in not having an education platform in the Constitution. No Department of Education. They thought it was up to the local community to govern and to choose how and what their children learned. And that they had great faith in the community at that time. I think we've lost that faith, and rightly so, because the community has been deceived, much of it. So we start at the community level, I do teach educational leaders. I teach them that, if you're a leader of a school building, you're not confined to the walls of the building. You have to go out into the community and see the community that you're serving and let them know that you care about them, because they are assuming that you don't, especially if you're not like them, because they've been taught that too. So we, as educators, we can do a lot. And I still have faith that we can kind of turn it around.
I think it's ironic, when you talk about the inequalities in the education system, or we can look at it, the incarceration system, this is why critical race theory should be taught, because it starts to really give us some introspective opportunities into dissecting this and understanding number one, that it still exists, and then allowing us to figure out why it still exists and how we can combat that. That frankly should be what everybody wants. And on some level, I think everybody does want that. Maybe not on the highest political levels, but I mean, on an individual level or a family level, I think that's what most of us believe we want, at least. So, yeah, I think that's just sort of a part of the irony of how this whole thing has been unpacked in communities. And absolutely, school leaders need to go out there and go out to the communities. I think, things have changed since our founding fathers established that, of course, because we've become a larger country. We've become more global and part of the world. And so I think to a large degree, while things still have to happen on the community level, we do function more as a country on a global level, than we certainly did when the country was first formed. So our systems and the way we function also have to adapt accordingly. And it's just not the same. The kid in Nebraska isn't going to spend the rest of his life in Nebraska the way that he did at some point in his life, So I think that has to evolve. But yeah, I essentially agree with most of those points.
Speaking of not being stuck in one location, but we did just experience this, 2-3 year period of time where a lot of us were stuck in one location. How has COVID in some ways fueled this attack on public education? And if so, why? And how can it be walked back?
I teach educators, so I'd like to answer that somewhat. They're exhausted. They are exhausted. They had to turn on a dime and change all their teaching methods. Education is about a relationship. It's a relationship between the teacher and the students, and between the students and each other. And doing this, is okay, but it's not on a daily basis for 2 years. It really affected the teachers just as much as it did the children. But teachers really tried hard, and they got very little credit for it in the public view. So it's that, and so many of them are retiring and leaving, and for that reason, they are exhausted, but they're still trying to expect during a crisis to have the same level of progress that you did without the crisis is totally unacceptable. We are dealing with human beings, and children are more sensitive to a lot of things than adults are. So, the lag in the test scores, which are bogus to begin with, really, they're like a budget of some sort. These get that, and these get that. To use test scores as a way to attack teachers after a pandemic or during a pandemic is really unethical, and to make children think that they are behind. That's the last thing you want someone to say to somebody, is that you're behind. So we talk about the achievement gap. This is why the data is so important. This is why critical race theory is so important. It's a theory. This is why looking at data is so important. You can see in hard evidence that we treat some children differently than we treat others. So we have to just face up to it and change it. or it's not going to change. It hasn't changed in the past 150 years, the hundreds. The 45-minute high school period was invented in 1905 by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And so I'm doing consulting on block scheduling in the 1990s, and I'm at school board meetings at town halls in Massachusetts where people just speak out, and they went to block scheduling, 90-minute periods. When some guy gets up in the audience, he says, I had that teacher when I was in high school. He's boring in 45 minutes. He's going to be twice as boring in 90 minutes. So we're kind of resistant to change also, but we have to change it because it is not working well for our kids and our society.
Rose, you're exposing something in what you just said, which is so true, which is that our measurement system is flawed. And it's not just our measurement system in standardized testing, but it's our measurement system in society, in values, in how we look at learning, for example. We talk so much, we media, education pundits talk so much about the learning loss, right? But that is all entirely based on testing and some form of assessment that isn't necessarily taking everything into account. When I think of learning loss, I think of what the kid didn't see looking out of the window of the school bus for all those times, because the learning starts just by observing life. So there's the learning loss. But then I think about the learning gain. All of a sudden, all these kids learned what their parents did for the first time because they're all sitting there in the home together. Families started having family meals together that they didn't have time for before. The level of creativity that occurred on the internet from musicians to artists to people that didn't know they were musicians and artists, all of a sudden discovering their talents out of boredom, which leads to creativity, or whatever it is. That there's so much that happened during this period that was of learning gain. And one of the most tangible ones for me, because I run a organization called Ravi Unites Schools, which is a network of 150 schools internationally. And I just bring them together, classrooms across the world online for peer-to-peer learning on a global level. Really sounds kind of ambitious and difficult. Well, guess what? Every teacher in every classroom knows how to do that now, thanks to COVID, because they're all so familiar with the technology. A huge gain that allows our schools to become more global and allows our classrooms to become more global. What does that do? That leads to greater cultural competence. It leads to greater opportunities for people who think that they have so many differences to realize that they have much more in common. And once that happens, then a lot of these conversations go away because we have a much better understanding of each other, and those implicit biases start to disintegrate on a very organic level because we're getting to know each other on a global level, on a cultural level. So the gains that can come from this, if they're harnessed, exposed, talked about, and sustained, I think are phenomenal. And just from a purely academic education standpoint, if we also understand that our students will benefit from more formative assessments than summative assessments, the formative assessment process will enable many of these learning gains to be built upon for the benefit of our students and their global futures.
Hear, hear. The COVID crisis did politicize, I even say radicalize, a very small minority of very noisy people who misbehaved terribly around masking policies and for the period of time that schools were closed. And that came out of real grief over how to manage their work lives and their home lives and deal with this crisis. And they were looking for someone to blame. Rather than blaming a virus, they would blame any number of other causes or people or decision makers who were just trying to keep kids from dying by keeping them home. And we talk about learning loss, meaning points on a arbitrarily set standardized tests written by non-educators, as Dr. Rudnitsky said, that is designed to sort and sift, as our metric for deciding how our kids are now 3 years in, when in fact we can't have a conversation about, but for those policies, what might have occurred, how many more students and teachers might we have lost because we put this arbitrary notion around a learning pace ahead of their public safety. That did stimulate a certain subsection of our cultures around the country to engage in these fights that they've now expanded into so many other things. We have a group that calls itself the Oregon Moms Union. Well, it's not a union at all. It's a very conservative, far-right political action committee. And they spent 3 days last week in our state legislature going door to door with a very long list of demands about rerouting public education dollars to private causes for vouchers and so on and so forth. So they've expanded to a whole laundry list of conservative agenda items, but they came to this work because they were radicalized by the desire not to have their students home when it was not safe for them to be in school. It's a real shame to know but I would also say that it wasn't the majority of parents, and these messages that are coming from out of screaming mouths in school board meetings being disruptive, that's not the majority. And we saw that in the outcomes of the midterm elections around the country, where the great red tide did not occur. And so that if it was a political tactic, as I believe it wasn't a successful one. Most people do just want a public education system that is well-funded, well-run, and their children well-educated.
Mm.
And where every child gets what that child needs
Yes.
to flourish and to self-actualize. And that's going to take a lot more investment in children. We have not invested in our children. They don't vote. They're pawns in these arguments. And again, that's not moral, not even not unethical. It's not moral that we treat them that well. And some of this came out of the Industrial Revolution, that we had this big influx of immigrants, and we didn't know what to do with all the children, and so we had to organize them. And I am an education historian, obviously. 1856, William Torrey Harris, superintendent of St. Louis, Missouri schools, says, let's group them according to their age. Well, that's really arbitrary. Children develop at vastly different rates and in different ways, but we group them and get grade levels according to their age. And so if you don't keep up with your age, you have failed.
Mm.
And so it's the whole thing needs to be redone in a way that it affects everyone. There are plenty of elite private schools where kids don't have to raise their hand. They can just call out answers because everybody feels empowered to do that.
Mm.
That doesn't happen in public school. You're taught very, very early on, sit down, be quiet, and let the teacher talk. So this is obviously I'm a very progressive educator, but I love children too. That's one of the reasons why. And I love this country. I'm a first generation American, and education took me out of poverty on the west side of Manhattan, and I was just lucky that I was good at school, and that somebody noticed. So I want that to be something that we all notice in every child, not just some.
Beautiful. Well, you are all so wise on this topic, and it's really been a privilege to hear everyone's perspective on this. I think we could even have a part 2 on this conversation. There seems to be so much here. But I want to thank you all and just offer space if you have any last closing comments on this. We will be sharing this with the rest of the education committee and Flowbell advisors and anyone who's interested in this topic. So I'll share any thoughts that they have, and maybe there'll be a part 2 because this is really fruitful. But I'll leave it to each of you to just give us a closing thought or two.
Well, I think I just did mine, so I'm okay. But
Or
this has
not,
been,
you don't have to. If there's
it's
just
been a pleasure.
Well-
It's been a pleasure being involved in this, and I thank you. Thank you, Rivka and Dan, for getting us together.
yeah.
I'll just lead off of something Rose said, which you were saying that the whole thing needs to be reimagined, and that the kids have been told since they were young that they just should sit in the classroom and listen to what the teacher has to say. One of the things I tell my audiences all the time is that the future teacher is not the purveyor of knowledge, but the facilitator of experiences. All of the knowledge now is here, that in the phone. It didn't exist before when we created our public education system, but we have all that knowledge through technology, but we still have classrooms. So we should be using those classrooms as as laboratories where all of that knowledge is exercised and put into action, so that our children have an opportunity to not just show what they know, but show what they can do. That's really what I think the future of education is. And then also, I'm a partner in a boarding school for the poorest of the poor in India. We take these poorest kids that have no chance out of the villages at the age of 4, and we pay for their education up to their master's degree. The school is called Shanti Bhavan. Netflix did a 4-part documentary on us called Daughters of Destiny. And the reason why I share that with you is because it proves, and we continue to prove, that give any child an opportunity, that child can flourish and lead and help, and then really then bring everybody else from their communities up. As I always like to tell my audiences, true leadership is about empowering those below you to rise above you. And I think that's what all of our students understand, is that once they elevate to this high place, despite their circumstances, they're so motivated to make sure that everybody else not only has the same opportunities and achieve what they achieve, but has better opportunities and achieves more than they even achieve. So I think that can also be something that we incorporate into our education system, so that we do make sure that we give every child the opportunity, because if we do that, every child has a chance to succeed.
You both have such wonderful perspectives, and I think that if the education system could be designed by the people on this panel, we would be in a very different place as a society. The one humble additional suggestion I would add is that we really do need to be teaching information literacy, or media literacy, is how some people describe it, to every student, so that they are able to discern good from bad information on those phones that they are constantly glued to, and also that they learn critical thinking skills in a way that enables them to apply logic, reason, and analysis as they consume that information, good, bad, or otherwise, and grow into the citizens we hope our education system produces. They will be looking at a long life, and one hopes that we create lifelong learners who treasure and value good information and derive a sense of self out of that exploration for a lifetime. I don't think if all we do is test them on reading and math and then sort, sift, and label each of those children each year, that we are doing any of that. And so I would have a plea that if we redesign our education system, that these be embedded essential skills that we teach.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I'm sure
Thank
we'll
you.
continue this conversation soon. And happy holiday.
Happy holidays. Thank you.